It was never me against you. It was always us against the system. I'm Ray Myers. Welcome to Craft vs. Cruft. And today I'd like to show you this talk I'm working on called Core Conflicts in Reliability, Having Our Cake and Eating It. A month ago, I posted the abstract of this on LinkedIn, and a bunch of people said they wanted to see it, so here you go. And I noticed among them are two theory of constraints experts, been studying this a lot longer than I have, namely Steve Tendon of TameFlow and Karl of Conflict Club. Certainly would be interested to hear and share back any thoughts they or you all have on this. I think that the ideas and theory of constraints have a lot of application potentially to site reliability engineering. So let's get into it. We're going to talk about why I care about this topic, why we must try to approach solving organizational conflict. We're going to talk about why to take them seriously doesn't necessarily mean even acknowledging that they exist. I'm going to present that from a certain framing, conflicts are an illusion. We're going to show, in fact, this style of problem solving is integrated into the very DNA of DevOps, even though we don't always understand to use it. Generalizing from that classic DevOps example, we're going to learn a highly, surprisingly general framework for addressing conflict, which is called the evaporating cloud, and see several examples of how it applies to our world. Why am I here talking to you about this? Why do I think this is important? It boils down to organizations being bad at problem solving. And when I say that, I don't just mean that they are frequently bad at problem solving, but it's almost inevitable. It's a tendency that is built into the very act of creating an organization. And so we really can't get away from this. We need to find a way to address it. Perhaps you've had some sort of experience in your life that has made you realize this. One of mine came a few years ago. I was a site reliability engineer on the platform team at a small healthcare organization that was owned by a conglomerate. Now, we had our difficulties, but as far as I could tell, things were going pretty well. I had introduced no downtime deployments, which had a tremendous impact. I helped make developer on-call rotations less painful. I introduced root cause analysis for incidents and later for bugs and other things. But point being, the signal that I had was that I was doing well, and that platform team was doing well. In fact, we're doing great. Then, out of seemingly nowhere, the parent company declared our entire initiative a failure and essentially pulled the plug on us. A lot of people lost their jobs. I lost best manager I've ever had, one of the best work environments I've experienced. I lost my professional growth path, at least as I had conceived it at that time, and was watching a lot of people hurting that I couldn't protect. These things were personally devastating to me, but the thing that made it so hard to move on from is that it came out of nowhere. I feel like I would have been able to live with having failed, but I didn't even have a chance to fail. Whatever was going wrong, which to this day I only partially understand, it wasn't what we were being told to work on. Now, if you experience something like that, you may decide going forward you're just going to keep your head down and your fingers crossed. Honestly, that may be the more peaceful path, but as for me, I resolved to learn what I could, hoping that someday I might be in a situation to do more. One thing that I've learned, organizations have boundaries. Boundaries create blind spots. That is inevitable. We'll be in a situation where we feel that different people, different teams, different departments have different goals, sometimes at tension with each other and other times diametrically opposed. This is an illusion. Companies are goal-directed organizations, and there is only one goal. To accomplish it, we will have to create many sub-objectives, but to the extent that any of those sub-objectives appear at odds with one another, there is a higher goal that can orient us. So if organizations are bad at problem solving by their very construction, what can we do about this? What would it mean to get better at problem solving? I contend that includes changing our understanding of what a problem even is. Goldratt, the creator of Theory of Constraints, in an audio lecture called Beyond the Goal, defined a problem as a conflict preventing the achievement of a goal. He said something you're tempted to call a problem that isn't a conflict preventing the achievement of a goal, is actually just a gripe, not actually a problem. He also said conflicts do not exist in reality. Now, that's a pretty bold statement. Let me tell you a little bit more about what that means. What would it mean for there to be a conflict in reality? Like there's a contradiction in reality. Let's suppose we weigh an object, and one scale says it's 3 pounds, and this other scale says that it's 5 pounds. Imagine a physicist looking at this situation and saying, okay, well, the scales disagree. Let's just compromise. Let's just say that it's 4 pounds. No, that's not what a physicist would do. That's not a scientific approach to that problem. Either one of the scales is wrong and it's 3 pounds, or the other scale's wrong and it's 5 pounds, or maybe both of our scales are wrong, or maybe our entire concept of weight is wrong. They will go to that degree before they acknowledge that there's a conflict manifested in reality. So today we're not going to say, let's compromise. We're going to say, let's find out why our scales disagree. Now, I told you this style of thinking was sort of built into the origin of DevOps. So let's take a really classic example. Speed versus stability. Once upon a time, we might have been trying to decide, should we ship every 2 weeks or every 6 weeks? Now, suppose ops wants 6 weeks. They want a slower change management process with high ceremony. What do the devs want? Obviously not that. They want to ship faster. They are incentivized to pump more features out. So they want to do 2 weeks and have it be fast and unstable. We could compromise. We could do it every 4 weeks and it'll be less slow and kind of stable. Maybe we can live with this. Many people have made this kind of compromise. But at this point, many organizations have shown that there's a secret fourth thing. There's another option. Because with DevOps approaches at their best, we can be both fast and stable. So as it turns out, this wasn't actually a conflict. This was a collaboration opportunity. But why specifically wasn't it a conflict? There was a key assumption. All change is equally unsafe. Is that true? If our instability is usually caused by change, then it's very easy to assume that all change is equally unsafe, and therefore changing less frequently is always more safe than changing more frequently. Does that hold? It does not. As it turns out, the smallest changes are safest, and if we have a good release process, we can ship often and still have stability. We can have our cake and eat it too. So you see, a conflict is not solved when we compromise. A compromise is a lose-lose. But if we're able to establish that there never even was a conflict, we just thought there was, then there is a win-win. Then everyone can have what they need. Now, that particular problem and solution probably didn't come as any surprise for you. It's so old at this point, we might even wonder, how did we ever not understand that? Well, there was something very specific that was happening in many organizations that was preventing that problem from being solved sooner, which is incentives. At some point, as an organization grows and is divided into many different groups, including these two, it will tell these different groups through directives and incentives what priorities they need to be concerned with and not concerned with. It will tell devs, you exist to ship features. They want speed, therefore. They want to change things as fast as they possibly can. Whereas ops will typically have no particular interest in how fast the features get out, but they know they need to keep the site up, and they want stability. Now, and while we've now established that it's possible to have both of those at the same time, and the organization does want that, you notice no individual party in a position to do anything about it wants both of those things. Their natural position is to be at tension with one another. They believe their goals are an eternal conflict that can only be addressed with the next compromise. Ultimately, that tension was part of what brought about the DevOps movement. Some people see DevOps as a complete merging of Dev and Ops, which in some cases it is, but it's more accurate to say that it's a harmony between the two. It's a realization that what we all want is to meet the needs of the business together. Now, I'm sad to say, though, that if you're like me, you may have known about that particular conflict and resolution and others in DevOps or Agile and your other favorite organizational fads. And yet you see those as sort of isolated situations, not some sort of formula that you can bring into the next challenge and the next. But you can. And now we're going to learn how. This is called the evaporating cloud, or the conflict resolution diagram. It's from theory of constraints, which originated in manufacturing, but has influenced DevOps and many other things. Earlier, we looked at the very bold claim that conflicts are an illusion. I'm going to make an even bigger claim right now, which is that they are all, in some sense, the same illusion. All conflicts in an organization look like this. And I don't just mean that they all look like some combination of boxes and lines. I'm telling you, it's these exact boxes and lines every time. There are 5 of them, and they are in this order. Is it not clear what I mean? Let's give them some annotations. This is the evaporating cloud diagram. By convention, the letters in these positions are always the same. A is the overall objective that we all share in this situation. That objective needs B. That objective also needs C. B wants D. C wants D prime. And D prime are in conflict. So if we have a conflict, we can model it this way. Let's take the one we just looked at. Ultimately, what we want is to make customers happy, let's say. We need to respond to their needs and get feedback from them. We also need to provide them a stable system, so we need to release safely. We have belief that in order to respond to needs, we need to release more often. And we have belief that to release safely, we need to release less often. And every one of those arrows is an assumption. And if we're able to challenge any one of those assumptions, the conflict no longer exists. We saw which one was challenged earlier. We're able to cut this arrow. It is not actually necessary to release less often in order to release safely. We should release safely, and we still will, just not by doing so less often, in other ways. In fact, this cloud is actually a special case of a more general cloud that appears so often that it's used all the way up to organizational tensions like this one, all the way down to individuals and personal growth. This one was first published by Ellie Goldratt's daughter, Efrat, actually. Our objective is to be happy. To be happy, we need to be safe, and we also need satisfaction. Needing safety implies we avoid change. Satisfaction implies we do change. So obviously we can't both change and avoid change. So what happens? Does this mean we can never be happy, or at best there's some hard cap on how happy we can be because of this? Well, if we could cut this arrow, or we could cut this arrow, or we could cut this one, if we could challenge any of those assumptions, then there would no longer be a conflict. And we can truly be happy and eat cake. So let's look at those assumptions one by one. We assume our goal is to be happy. Now, some would challenge that as a goal, but let's just run with it. We assume that being happy requires being secure. We assume being happy also requires being satisfied. We assume being secure requires avoiding change. We assume being satisfied requires change. And we assume that changing is in conflict with avoiding change. Therefore, we can never be happy. I think if you sat and you thought about these for a while, you might find that several of them could be challenged. Does being secure really require avoiding change? Perhaps it only requires you to avoid some changes, not all. Or perhaps you can approach the changes differently in a way that ensures your security. Is the change you're thinking of really something you need in order to be satisfied? It may sound as though change is definitely in conflict with not changing, but that may be true of any individual change, but it's not true of change in general. We're obviously going to have some changes and avoid other changes, right? Now, people have gone a long way with this conflicts as self-improvement stuff, but let's go back to software, right? We want, once again, to make customers happy. We're pretty sure that in order to do that, we need new features. So we want to work on features. But something else that customers need to be happy is a high quality product. And so that makes us want to add more tests. It's another thing that we want to work on. So do we spend our time working on features or adding more tests? It seems as though one of them is going to end up being more important and need to win. But what are the assumptions? I think we're pretty well on board with the goal. We assume making customers happy requires new features. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Making customers happy requires high quality. We're pretty sure of that. New features require working on features as fast as possible. High quality requires writing more tests. And finally, we assume working on features as fast as possible is in conflict with writing more tests. Therefore, we can never make customers happy, or we're going to have to make some compromise that's going to limit how happy we make customers. Again, I bet if you thought about it, you could put a dent in some of these assumptions. For instance, is it really true that working on features as fast as possible is in conflict with writing more tests? Might there be a world in which having better testing helps us work on features, is actually in service of working on features? If it's actually true, and this is not so far-fetched, that working in a well-tested system is going to allow us to work on features faster, then perhaps this conflict wasn't really there. These are all very general, and I encourage you to workshop your own, but I want to give you just one example that is very specific. This came up just in the last week. We're working on some alerting standards. In order for these standards to be successful, they have to meet our needs. And as it turns out, our needs appear to be very complex. But we also want people to actually adopt this standard and follow it. And that means following it needs to be easy. In order for it to be easy, we'd like it to not be complex. So what can we do here? Well, my first instinct was to simplify. Can we match our needs in a simpler way? To some extent, yes, but as I talked to the experts, I wasn't actually able to make as much headway in that direction as I wanted. It was a little simpler, but it's still pretty complex. And I was very worried that people were going to find out they were in violation of the standard, and it wasn't clear because there were just so many different fiddly requirements what they needed to do about it. So it wouldn't be easy to adopt, and therefore this wouldn't be a success. So having failed to fully cut that top arrow between B and D, I focused my attention on, can it be easy to adopt even if it's complex? And I believe I have a way of cutting that arrow, which is to provide automated feedback such that the system won't just tell you if you're out of compliance, it'll tell you exactly why. We'll see how this works out, but the theory is this will be both as complex as it needs to be, but still be easy to adopt. Once again, we can have our cake and eat it too. And finally, I'll show you that that's not just figuratively true, it's also true if we make that expression literal. If you happen to be watching from a place in the world that doesn't have this expression, the expression is you can't have your cake and eat it too. And it's meant to communicate that everything is a trade-off, everything requires some kind of sacrifice. And I guess the idea is that if you eat the cake, then you're not going to have it afterwards. So it seems that someone wants to enjoy the cake now and later. And that is our goal. So as expressed, what is the perceived conflict? Well, in order to do that, we need to enjoy it now, and we need to enjoy it later. And so to enjoy it now, we need to eat the cake now, and to be able to enjoy it later, we need to not eat the cake now. Now, this phrase is meant as the very archetype of an unsolvable conflict, and yet, I submit, perhaps I just eat half the cake today and half the cake to tomorrow. I'm having my cake and eating it. But hey, that sounds an awful lot like a compromise. I said we shouldn't settle for that. We can do even better, right? Is it really true that enjoying the cake later implies that we don't eat it now? Why don't we just buy 2 cakes? Who said we're limited to 1 cake? There could be 2 cakes. It seems like such an obvious solution that it's foolish to even mention it, but I've seen plenty of real-world conflicts over contention of some resource that would be equally trivial to go get another of. Once upon a time, I even heard people say that pair programming was too hard because they had to pass the keyboard back and forth, to which I say, How hard is it to have 2 keyboards? Not that much harder than buying a second cake, surely. And hey, if we want to get really creative, enjoying the cake now might not even require eating it. You could just give a talk about cakes like I'm doing right now. I felt all day as though I were enjoying cakes and I haven't even eaten one yet. Perhaps I will later. Some final tips to make this sort of thing work. You do need to have the common goal. You do need to truly understand it. So make sure you have unity of purpose. Embrace both sides of the conflict. Don't just put one person's perception of what the other party's needs and wants are on display. You're going to get the best solutions by starting with empathy to all sides. And finally, the secret sauce here is really surfacing the assumptions. And sometimes there are assumptions behind those assumptions. So if you haven't found that assumption that's going to allow you to cut through the entire conflict, keep looking, keep asking why. This is kind of like root cause analysis. Just remember to keep your eye on the prize. You can have that cake. If you want to learn more about this, the evaporating cloud was first introduced in the novel It's Not Luck by Goldratt, which was a sequel to The Goal. Incidentally, a lot of people aren't aware of this, but Gene Kim and others' novel The Phoenix Project, which is kind of the founding myth of DevOps, was actually a rewrite of The Goal. And they actually took that parable about manufacturing in the 80s and turned it into something about IT in the early 2000s. If business novels aren't your thing, as I mentioned, I really enjoyed the audio lecture Beyond the Goal. And more of a textbook format is by Bill Dettmer called The Logical Thinking Process. What about videos? Well, we've got those too. On my YouTube channel, Craft vs. Cruft, I have a number of episodes about theory of constraints shown here, including some on the evaporating cloud. And on the left, you see some other accounts that I like for this kind of content. Feel free to comment or subscribe if you'd like to hear more. Thank you for watching. And as Lao Tzu said in the Tao Te Ching, with patience, the most tangled cord may be undone. Thank you.